Hi, and welcome to It's Not Obvious Software Industry Edition. Today, I will be talking about finding jobs. Specifically, in this episode, I'm going to talk about different types of software companies, including work-life balance, expectations and pay scale, technology stacks versus roles, also contracting versus full-time employment, what to do with job descriptions when you come across job descriptions as you're preparing for your future interviews, as well as applying timeline and expectations in general, because I will be discussing resume more in a future episode. As part of this, I will also discuss this concept of predicting the future, because essentially you are preparing for a future job and predicting what's going to happen with the market in the future. This episode is really intended for people who are new to the software industry and interested in starting an engineering career in software. Now, if you haven't yet, I highly recommend that you watch my previous episode that has to do with hiring and recruiting in Amazon. And as a brief review, I will be touching a little bit on recruiting pipelines in this episode to talk about how people could get hired or how people could find these opportunities through those pipelines. Why am I doing this? I want to do this because I want to connect with more people as well as scale my ability to share what I hope is relevant information. Essentially, what that means is that I find that I provide a lot of the same advice to a lot of different people, so I figure I might as well record it and share it more broadly to viewers such as you. Okay, great. Now, a question that's probably going to come up, and I want to address it sooner rather than later, is are you going to learn how to get hired? And the short answer is not quite. There are 3 stages, in my opinion, in terms of job seeking, or I use the acronym RIO. The first part is recruitment, the second part is interviews, and the third part is offer and negotiation. This episode focuses on identifying jobs to apply to, which is just the first stage, just the recruitment stage. Okay? Now, who am I, if it matters? I am currently a software manager in Amazon. I'm Hansel, and I have been in Amazon for a total of almost 7 years at the time of this recording. Okay, and if you want to find out more about me or the kind of things that I've done, definitely find me on LinkedIn and connect with me there. I would be more than happy to accept a connection request. Great. Now, another question that comes up as you're watching this episode, and I want to address it now, is this an Amazon sponsored thing? The short answer is no. This is my own opinion and my own observations, and in general, I can only talk about things that I can publicly share. In other words, this is not an Amazon sponsored thing, even though my day job, I am currently a software manager in Amazon. Okay, great. Now, let's talk about where to find jobs. If you're a student, the number one pipeline for you is going to be internships. Internships are going to be the absolute best pipeline, the absolute best way for you to get a job. If you're a student and you're not looking for internships yet, you definitely should. Now, if you're a student and you're on your last year of school and you're graduating, well, internships might not be a viable pipeline for you. Then you're going to have to go through other pipelines such as organizations or communities in your school that helps you find that first job in after you graduate. Okay, now aside from that, there are of course job search websites, and the number one thing that comes to mind is of course LinkedIn. And no, LinkedIn is not paying me. That said, I have been a customer of LinkedIn for a very long time before Microsoft acquired them actually, and have been very happy with how well they're able to connect me with other people in the industry, as well as how well people have found me, how recruiters have found me and reached out to me for various opportunities that have helped me get to where I am. Okay, and keep in mind that most companies actually have a career section with job listings. So here, for example, I'm going to show you the Amazon Jobs website. Okay, so if you were to look at the Amazon Jobs website, you can search for jobs in a lot of different ways. One, you can simply type in the title or keyword of the kind of job you're looking for, or you can actually scroll down and find jobs based on teams, job categories, and locations. If you were to say, for example, open job categories and go to it, you can see that there's a lot of different categories available to you. Let's say that you are a designer, or let's say that you are a business intelligence person, or you have done a lot of buying, planning, and in-stock management. The idea is you're supposed to go here first and look for opportunities, and then you can open something. So let's say if you were to go to medical, health, and safety. This lists a whole bunch of different type of jobs, and say, for example, here, in um, Washington, in Seattle, you have Risk Manager 2, and there's multiple positions available. You can click on something like this, and it's going to show you a job description and basic qualifications and preferred qualifications. Now, this is actually kind of small, kind of short in terms of responsibilities and qualifications. Let's look at another one just to be sure. Now, the number one job that comes to mind, of course, when it comes to Amazon or software companies in general would be software development. And you can see at this point in time, at the time I'm recording this video, there are over 16,000 jobs available for software development. If you click on it, again, you can scroll down and you can see a lot of different ways to apply. And you can see, for example, in Washington, there's software development engineer, and there's a longer description, other qualifications that you have to keep in mind. All right, cool. You should definitely also tell people that you're looking for a job. And when you tell people that you're looking for a job, definitely ask them if they know anyone with an opening that's appropriate for what you're looking for. And that's one of the pro tips there in terms of building that kind of pipeline for yourself. Talk to people, tell them what you're looking for, and tell them that you're available, and then ask them if they don't know any such positions, do they know anyone who knows of such positions? That way you get to network a little bit further than just the people you have immediate access to. You should also find communities on organizations with pipelines, with recruiting pipelines that are relevant to you. Now, if you don't know of any such communities or organizations with relevant pipelines, you can also go to, say, for example, this AWS training for Restart, and coming back again to the web browser. AWS Restart is a program that helps people launch careers. It's a curriculum, and it helps you get started in a lot of different ways. Okay, cool. There's a lot of different pipelines out there, and part of the challenge is finding the appropriate pipeline. But before you even find the appropriate pipeline, you need to figure out for yourself, what kind of job do you want to do? Okay, so let's start by talking about software companies. Software companies, typically what comes to mind are traditional or primarily software companies. So, of course, you can think of big technology companies such as FAANG companies, which typically stands for Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google. Sometimes people also throw Microsoft into it. Microsoft is definitely a big employer too. And there's a bunch of other big tech companies too, in addition to the FAANG companies. It's typically just shortened to that for ease of discussion. And then there's large companies, which are typically defined as company with more than 1,000 employees. For example, Zoom, which over the past year and a half during the pandemic, a lot of people probably have used. And in fact, Zoom grew a lot during the pandemic. They went from a relatively small company, from what I remember, into a really big company with a lot of valuation. Then there's medium-sized companies that are 100 to 999 employees, and startups and small companies that are less than 100 employees. Okay, now you should also be thinking about companies that are not primarily software companies. For example, airlines. Alaska Airlines have their own software division, and in fact, at one point in time, I actually taught their employees how to do software testing and software development. And hospitals, Children's Hospital, I have an uncle who have worked in a hospital in software. And schools such as the University of Washington, of course, have their own tech department, software development for a lot of different tools and so on, and web development also. Government entities such as Sound Transit, I have a friend right now who is currently an intern and hoping to be a full-time employee at Sound Transit, and others such as real estate like Redfin, or entertainment such as Disney. Disney, interestingly enough, is a really, really big employer for a lot of software stuff. And it's really fascinating the kind of stuff that Disney has done in the software industry in the past, let's say 10 years. Now, another thing that you should think about when it comes to software companies is, what about the company culture? What about the work-life balance? What about the expectations? What about the pay scale? And the question, of course, is how can you find out what the work-life balance, expectations, and the pay scale are like? One way to do that is by networking with people who are already working in those companies and chatting with them, asking them questions, looking up articles, or going to something like glassdoor.com. Now, there's also another website called blind.com, which is kind of interesting. And personally, as a manager, And as somebody in the software industry, I'm kind of terrified to go to blind.com because blind are is basically this anonymous place where employees in various companies go to complain about anything and everything, and it becomes an extremely negative place real fast, I think. But if you're really concerned about a lot of things about the company culture, work-life balance, and so on, and you want to hear that negative aspect of things, blind is probably a good place to go to. If you want to have a more balanced perspective, then the best way is still going to be to find someone, network with someone, and then chat with them. Buy them coffee, get them lunch, or something like that, and just take some of their time to talk about it. Or if you want, I also have my own events where you can talk to me and ask me any questions you want about what it's like in different companies, especially in Amazon, and what the work-life balance is like, expectations, and pay scale. If you really care about the pay scale, and you may have heard that there's a lot of variance when it comes to pay scale, there's glassdoor.com that kind of gives you an idea in terms of what different pay scales are like for different jobs, for different levels in different companies. Now, in general, work-life balance is going to be very specific to the company and to the team that you're a part of. In general, I think that most companies and most managers try to have people work within the 40-hour work week. Some managers are a bit more successful at that, and some employers, some companies are a little bit worse on that. Now, personally, I'm biased towards Amazon, and I personally do think that Amazon is great in terms of providing the relevant work-life balance for me and my team and the people I've worked with. That said, I have definitely heard of horror stories, especially for certain types of people and certain types of roles in certain locations. I'm not going to mention what those are. You can probably find those articles yourself. Now, if you were to go to startups, on the other hand, a lot of startups typically have not great work-life balance because they're hungry, they're trying to get a bunch of stuff done. And I said hungry just now, that's kind of a term in the industry. Being hungry for results, being hungry for customers, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That just means that you are pushing hard in order to get things done. But startups can sometimes push people a little too hard, and it can totally consume your life. And the work-life balance for startups typically tends to be pretty bad unless you have a good manager or a good culture of the founders. In terms of expectations, for the bigger companies, typically the expectations are a little bit more refined and a little bit more defined. When it comes to smaller companies, the expectations tends to be a little bit more fuzzy, and you might have to wear multiple hats at once depending on what they need at any given time. In terms of pay scale, of course, big tech companies typically will pay the most and startups will pay the least. Okay. As far as companies that are not primarily software companies, it just really depends. I've had people really like working at an airline type of company, at a hospital, at schools, government entities, real estate, entertainment, and I've had other people who absolutely hated it. So it just depends. But you do want to know ahead of time, and you do want to understand what you're getting into before you get into it. Okay, so technology stacks and roles. The top question that I get is, what programming language do I need to learn? And I personally think that this is the wrong question. And a lot of times, part of the reason why I think this is the wrong question is because people typically assume that to work in software, you must know how to program. That is true if you're working for a predominantly software companies and you're looking for software development or software engineering jobs. Now, if you're not looking for a software engineering job, it's helpful to know how to program, but it's not needed at all. And besides, the other aspect as to why this is the wrong question to ask is because programming is really just translating English or whatever language you speak into a programming language. So think about it this way. We have multiple languages in the world. We have English, we have Chinese, we have Japanese, we have Russian, we have a lot of different languages. And the idea is we are going to be translating from one language to another depending on who we talk to, depending on the circumstances. Well, the computer understands programming languages, or at least it's supposed to understand programming languages. And we're really just converting the day-to-day human language that we use into what the computer understands. So Another way to think about this is that programming, the translation of English to a programming language, is actually the easiest part of the job, because the harder part of the job is actually to solve problems, to identify ways to build a program that is useful for people to use. Think about it another way. We're not looking for someone who can just speak English or write English or something like that. We're looking for someone who is fluent enough with the language to, for example, write a novel or design a movie that a lot of people are going to want to watch. Same thing with programming. We're not just looking for people who can speak the language or write a programming language. That's not it. That's the easiest part of the job. The correct question then is, instead you should be asking, what do you need to learn to do well in the job? And in a future episode, I do want to talk about what SDEs, what software development engineers do in Amazon and some of these bigger companies. And the spoiler is that a big part of the job is not about writing code 24/7, or rather 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week. That's not what the job is about. There's a lot of problem solving. There's a lot of collaboration that happens for software development engineers. Okay, you should also be thinking about common technology stacks for engineering type jobs. So say, for example, JavaScript. When it comes to JavaScript, a lot of times people nowadays think about React and Node. You might want to think about Java, Python, C++, Swift, or Objective-C or C#. You're not expected to be an expert in all of these languages. You just need to know enough in order to pass the interview and then do the job. Chances are, once you are employed, once you are hired, you're going to have to learn a whole lot of new technologies anyway. And it's also pretty common to come into a job knowing a different language and having to learn a completely new language. So say, for example, in Amazon, I had to use Java for a big part of my career, and then Python. And before Amazon, I had never used Java or Python at all. I simply learned on the job, and that is part of the expectations. There's new things that happen all the time. Okay. Now, in terms of roles in the software industry, there's a lot of different roles. And earlier, when we looked at the Amazon job site, there are a whole bunch of different categories already that you can see. And these are the more common types that I'm aware of. Engineering types: software development engineer, quality assurance engineer, in other words, software testers, SDETs, software development engineer in test, web development engineer, front-end engineer, data engineer, hardware engineer, business intelligence engineer, support engineer, and a whole bunch of stuff. And then there's also different management types, such as TPM, technical project manager, PM, which actually breaks down to project manager and program manager, PMT, which is program manager technical. Now, there is actually a distinction between PMT and TPM, and these are actual roles from Amazon and might not necessarily translate directly to another role in another company, but you kind of get the idea. There's also a QA manager, in other words, a test manager, software development manager, and there's a lot of different types of managers too. Okay, and then if you are a science type of person, you do research, there are definitely research scientists, data scientists, UX researchers, and a lot of these have to do with developing new experiences, or in the case of research scientists, a lot of times nowadays people think about machine learning type of research and type of science development. And then of course there's creative types, business types, and there's other types. Now, for example, there are security, because a lot of the campuses need to hire their own security. Now, I think a lot of security is actually outsourced, and so you can interview for a security company that, say, provides security services to Facebook campus or Amazon campus and so on. My sister actually did this for a while, and another friend of mine did security for Facebook for a while too. Horticulture. You might not think that software companies or technology companies need horticulture, but there are definitely companies that hire horticulture experts. Tech support, seller, buyer, legal, there's a lot of different roles available to you. So my goal here is to get you to think beyond software development, and I hope that this is something that wasn't necessarily obvious to you before coming to this episode, that you're not restricted to just software development. There's a lot of roles in the software industry that you could apply to. Okay, so let's talk about job descriptions. The idea behind job descriptions is that you should look at job descriptions for several different jobs that you're interested in. You should probably ignore specifics: technology, years, education, etc. All right, so let's take a look at the browser again, and let's take a look at, let's say, for example, this type of description. Okay, so we want to think about, for example, it says here, it says, do you want to influence the experience of millions of customers? You should think of that as a big scale. Millions of customer is a large scale. Do you want to work in a collaborative environment that impacts products from across the company? Again, that probably means that you're going to be working within your team as well as with partner teams inside of the company, and it has impact across the company. We redefine the customer contract experience by exposing a new messaging-based contact channel, message us, etc., etc. And as a software development engineer in this team, you will collaborate with other senior software engineers to drive improvements to our technology, design, and develop new services and solutions. Services and solutions is another keyword where you would think of it in terms of web services or other types of services that are available. Chat platform, specific kind of technology. We use Scrum, test-driven development, continuous deployment. Again, a lot of these are just jargon that just says, hey, this is how we do things. You don't really need to know a lot of that. Instead, you'll think of it as, say, for example here, 0 to 1 years of software engineering experience. This is an entry-level position. It doesn't require a lot of experience. Now, a lot of times, these types of job descriptions will include some sort of specific bachelor's degree in computer science or whatever. The not so secret type of thing to think about this is that as long as you have some sort of a degree, or as long as you have some sort of qualification that you can or you have done software development job, the degree actually doesn't matter quite so much. It helps to get your resume noticed, which again I'll mention in a future episode, but for the most part, don't worry about it too much. Strong coding ability using Java, C, C++, or similar programming languages. Again, the specific programming language doesn't matter quite so much. In fact, during the interview stage, as an interviewer or as a hiring manager, a lot of times I'll just tell the candidate to be like, well, this is the coding problem. Use whatever language you want. It doesn't really matter which language you use. Okay, cool. Then there's also preferred qualifications, master's degree, 2+ years, proficiency in object-oriented design, coding ability using Java. The keyword here is probably object-oriented design. That has to do with a very particular frame of mind that has to do with programming. How do you know this? You wouldn't know this unless you've looked at this before, unless you've listened to this kind of episode, unless you've talked to people in the industry. So again, the idea is, instead of focusing too much on the specifics, look at the generalizations, look at the technology, years, education to understand the pattern of what the employers are looking for and why. Now, in terms of technology, a lot of times it's split into web or database or mobile or services. In the case of what we looked at just now, it falls under services. Could also do visualization, UI, UX, research, recruiting, etc. And the thing to keep in mind is that technology and tools change all the time. The fundamental skills associated with using those technology a lot of times can effectively be applied to new technologies, to new tools, and so on. You should also think about whether you want a full-time job or a contract job. And in general, a full-time job is nice because you get full-time benefits and you get more perks a lot of times if the company has perks. But a full-time job also means that you have a salary, and technically you might be required or you might be expected to work beyond 40 hours a week. Now, if you have a good manager, if you have a good team, if you have a good company, typically those kinds of things are considered heroics when you have to work more than 40 hours a week. And ideally, the team you work for has very little to no heroics and only when you really absolutely have to. The nice thing about contract positions, on the other hand, is that you are paid by the hour. A lot of times you're paid a little bit lower than a salaried employee, but you're guaranteed that for however many hours that you work, that's all that you're expected to do. You're done. And the other nice thing about a contract type of position is if you are the kind of person who likes to explore and look at different opportunities, try out different teams, contract opportunities provide those kinds of opportunities by default because typically you're going to stay with a particular team for some period of time, a few months, and then you're expected to take a break. And when you come back, you can try again for the same team or you can go to another team. Contract positions are also typically a lot easier to interview for, a lot easier to get. Full-time positions typically have much higher expectations. Again, in a future episode, I'll explain why that is, why contract is a little bit easier to get into as opposed to full-time. Some things to keep in mind. Managers, again, if you were to watch my previous episode that has to do with hiring and recruiting, managers really need to hire someone to accomplish an arbitrary business objective. And managers, a lot of times, are the ones who write the job descriptions, but the business needs that the manager is supposed to address with the team who is reporting to the manager, it changes along the way. The manager is not going to get a candidate that exactly fits the job at the moment that the job becomes available, at the moment that the manager posts the job description. Typically, there's going to be some amount of time that's going to pass, which is the next slide, by the way, applying timeline and expectations. There's going to be some amount of time that passes from when the manager posts the job and when somebody's hired for it. In the meantime, the business continues to change, the expectations, the needs continues to change. And so the translation, the thing you should think about this is that managers a lot of times don't need someone super specific. We just need to get someone who can be hired and who can begin contributing as soon as they're hired. That's really what it's about. So don't think about the job descriptions too much. And I know I've fallen into this myself, especially when I was new to the industry, where I would look at a job position and I would go, oh my God, it sounds like this job is custom made for me and this is my dream job ever. I'm totally the perfect person for this. Maybe you're thinking that too. Chances are it's not quite that way at all. Chances are it is completely different than what the job description specifically defines. For example, earlier we saw that the job description mentions working with chatbots. Who knows by the time that position is filled if the team is still working with chatbots or if they've moved on to a different kind of technology or a different kind of solution that they're exploring. So look at generalizations, look at patterns, and think about the patterns and understand that that's really what you're looking for. Now, if you have several job descriptions that you're interested in and you can clearly identify the pattern, let's say you're interested in a job that works with mobile devices, that works with mobile entertainment, that is a pattern. And that is the kind of pattern that you need to identify for yourself as well as prepare for those kinds of interviews. Okay, great. Let's talk about timeline and expectations. Now, on the left-hand side here, I have the fastest timeline. Either way, whether you go with the fastest timeline or the realistic timeline, you are at some point going to submit your resume. You're going to have some sort of callback or interview schedule at some point, and then you're going to have an interview. You're going to have a decision and offer, assuming you pass the interview. And at some point, you are going to begin your new employment, assuming you accept the offer. Now, the fastest timeline, if you think about this, is you have the resume submitted, and the next day, somebody calls you back and sets up an interview schedule. And then maybe on the same day, once you get the call back and once you get the interview schedule, it's entirely possible that they will just conduct the interview right then and there. It rarely happens for the bigger companies, but for the smaller companies, especially let's say for a startup, it can totally happen that on the same day you are scheduled for an interview, or maybe the callback is the interview itself. And potentially on the same day or on the next day, there's a decision that was made. Hey, we do want to hire you. This is how much we're willing to offer you. Are you okay with that? Now, assuming this kind of fastest timeline, the very absolute fastest that you can get hired would be between 2 days to 1 week. And again, this is highly unrealistic unless if the team is really desperate to hire someone and it's more of a startup kind of situation. And typically in that kind of situation, you're not gonna be offered a large sum of money to be employed. Now, the more realistic timeline is that at some point you submit your resume. It typically takes anywhere between 2 weeks to who knows how long. before you get a call back or interview schedule. And let's say that you do get the call back, the interview schedule, then typically you need to schedule some sort of a phone screen or online assessment, and you typically have anywhere between 1 to 2 weeks. So let's say about 2 weeks. And then after the phone screen or online assessment, you have about a week to get a response, and the next schedule to go from the phone screen, the online assessment, onto the quote unquote on-site. Then, of course, you are going to schedule the on-site, and typically the on-site, it takes time to schedule the right people to come and interview you. So typically it's going to be about 2 weeks out, sometimes even longer than that. And assuming you did well on the on-site and the company or the team wants to give you an offer, it sometimes takes about a week again to get a response, to get an offer. And the total here is still at about 6 weeks minimum. And even at 6 weeks, it's still really, really, really fast. Now, Amazon in general have a pretty good recruiting process. But again, remember that I'm from Amazon and I'm totally biased. And remember again, this is not an Amazon thing. This is just my experience and what I have seen for myself. Amazon's usually pretty good at calling people back, at scheduling things, and making sure that people get a response early enough, usually within 3 to 5 business days, kind of thing, for the for the phone screen or online assessment or the on-site. That said, not to talk bad about other companies, I have applied to other FANG companies and ended up waiting about 6 months before I hear back from them, and then scheduling out an interview, let's say a month or two out. And it just takes a really long time. It's like submit the resume and wait for a few months until something happens. And that is, from what I've heard, a more common experience outside of Amazon, where you might have to wait for a few months before they get back to you, even if they are interested in your profile, even if they're interested in your resume. So sometimes, especially for job seekers, especially if you're eager to get started in the software industry, there's this desire to submit a resume and then just wait. Obsessively refresh the page, obsessively check your email, obsessively check your voicemail, your messages to see if, for example, there's a response just yet. Chances are for software industries, that's not going to happen unless if you were to apply to a startup or a much, much smaller company. Okay. And a note here that I have is that typically it takes about 6 to 12 months to find and land a new job. And if you're doing a new career, it's potentially a lot longer. Okay. Let's talk about predicting the future. Given enough time, you can probably learn everything that you need for the job. But the reality is, unless you are prepared now and you're prepared to go through that resume, that interview process right now, right this moment, you are actually preparing for a future job. And the question then is, how far in the future? Now, in the previous slide, I mentioned that it typically takes 6 to 12 months to get a new job. That means that you're actually preparing for a job that's going to be available 6 months to 12 months from now. Now, I don't know about you. In the software industry, 6 months to 12 months, a lot of things change very drastically in that time frame. And the question then becomes, what does the future job market hold for you? What's in it? What do you need to prepare to do well in that future? And the reality is that employers and managers don't know either what it takes, what they need from potential employees 6 months to 12 months from now. There are typically multi-year roadmap where the companies are thinking about, okay, this is what we're accomplishing this year, this is what we're accomplishing next year, and so on and so on and so on. But those change very drastically all the time, especially in the software industry. Okay, and the recommendation here is that you need to continue learning. You need to look up those job descriptions, find those patterns, learn the relevant things for the jobs you're interested, and specifically, you need to grow your fundamentals. You need to find those patterns and you need to evolve with those patterns so that you can prepare for a future job that might not actually exist just yet. All right, so answering the question again, how do you get hired? The first step, of course, is to identify what kind of job you want, why you want it, and what's needed to do the job well. And here I note that you need passion, and passion is something that can come out, that very frequently comes out during the interview, and interviewers and hiring managers will notice that. They will go, wow, this candidate is really interested in this job, or this candidate is really interested in this technology space. Because in addition to all the stuff that they've done, they've also looked into the latest trends, they've looked into the latest technology, the latest news, and they've also experimented with it. And their questions reflect their passion, their interest in this field. Every so often, I end up with a candidate where, let's say, they interview for an Alexa type position. And then they come to the interview, and I go, hey, do you know what Alexa is? And they go, no. And I'm like, well, but you do know you're interviewing for a position in the Alexa team. And they're like, yes. And I go, okay. Have you worked with any sort of voice digital assistant? And they go, no. And I'm like, well, what interests you about this position? And sometimes I don't necessarily ask that question straight out, of course. But it kind of makes you wonder from an interviewer, from a hiring manager perspective. It's like, well, clearly you're not prepared for this interview, and clearly you're not prepared for to work in this field. So, and a lot of times for people who are like that, their answers, their responses kind of reflect it, and we can clearly see that it might not be a good fit, regardless of how intelligent or how successful they have been in previous positions. If they're not interested in the space and the technology that they're going to be working with, chances are it's not going to be a good fit, unfortunately. Okay. Anyway, so in a future episode, I'll talk a little bit more about that, as well as resume and how to get your resume and professional profile noticed. And in general, you need to highlight your relevant accomplishments, and you need to do some sort of resume review with keywords, with objective metrics of success. You also need to leverage your network, potentially to get an introduction, internal referral, or you can just do the shotgun approach where you just submit your resume everywhere and hope that somebody responds to you. And another question, of course, is, do degrees and certificates matter? I mentioned it a little bit earlier that up to a point, it can get your resume noticed, but in the long run, your work experience matters a lot more. Again, slight spoilers for a future episode. And then, of course, you need to actually prepare for the interview itself, and you need to know what you need to demonstrate in order to pass the interview, and you need to prepare for it properly. So, in closing, I do want to have you remember that recruiters and hiring managers are very much actively seeking candidates like you. We do need to hire, and we want you to apply to positions, but we also want you to be prepared for it. Okay? So as always, I'm going to end this episode by asking you some questions. What were some things that were obvious to you? Were there anything new that you learned from this episode? And if there are other things in this episode that I glossed over, that it seems to be obvious to me, but it's not obvious to you, definitely mention it in the comments, and I'll let you know. I'll respond to it, or I'll create a new episode to respond to it. And as always, if you like this episode, please subscribe for more content. Okay, thank you, and see you next time.